if greed wasn't perhaps a primary factor, and if assuming that, well, Enron went into some spaces that they didn't have core competencies. They had viable business models in some, and then they went into things like broadband, tried to use some of the same models and decision-making frameworks. And obviously, we know it didn't work. Did that create a pressure that ultimately led to Enron's demise?
Yes, I believe that's the case. And let me answer the question, maybe in a couple of different ways. I'll get to some of the, I think, specific examples around some of the business units. But, one of the events, and I'm not the only one I know that has had this observation. If you go back to 1996, in sort of the life of Enron, Ken Lay was the chairman and CEO. A fellow by the name of Rich Kinder was the chief operating officer, president and chief operating officer. I think that Mr. Kinder had an expectation around that time that I think had been developed by Ken Lay, that he was going to become the CEO, and that Ken Lay was going to become the non-executive chairman. For whatever reason, Ken Lay decided he wanted to continue to be the chief executive officer of Enron. I think Rich Kinder was at a point in his career where he wasn't willing to wait any longer, and ultimately went on to create a very successful company called Kinder Morgan, which is an asset-based company. Rich was sort of the kind of chief operating officer that every company should have. He was a very sort of nuts and bolts. He held people very accountable for the bottom line. He was very disciplined, I think, in how businesses got built out, and was the right person. I think the story of Enron would have been, I think, quite different had Rich Kinder stayed.
And may have survived today.
I think that's right. I believe that's right. But what happened was Rich left in 1996. Jeff Skilling, who had been in charge of the wholesale business at Enron, was named the chief operating officer.
Former McKinsey consultant.
Right. Jeff was Jeff was and is a brilliant individual. He had ideas that no one else could conceive of, and but his ability, I think, he was an idea person. He wasn't a Rich Kinder. He wasn't someone that frankly took much joy in the day-to-day execution of a chief operating officer role. He didn't hold people accountable in the way that I think a competent chief operating officer could, and I think that contributed to a lack of discipline in how the business conducted itself over the subsequent 5 years, and that evidenced itself in some of the build-out of the new businesses. I think there was an arrogance, that contributed to, say, broadband. There was just this belief, we've taken certain ideas and principles, we've applied them to natural gas and electricity. Broadband, why not? And instead of, building a business initially with 50 people or 25 people, giving them an opportunity to prove themselves before essentially they break the bank, Enron and Jeff, and I think this came from the lack of discipline. He sort of evidenced as a chief operating officer, he would throw 1,000 people, at a new business, with little regard, for budgets, and that creates certain pressures in and of itself, for that new business unit to produce in a way that is unrealistic. I think that there's the other thing, Enron from 1994, 95, up through almost the end, had consistently promised 15% earnings growth, every quarter, every year. That's a tough, that's a tough target to meet when the overall economy is growing at 3%. Most businesses don't grow, consistently at 15%. That creates another set, I think, of behaviors and incentives that led to some of the, I think some of the stories, some of the behaviors that have become, sort of the more prominent ones in the history of Enron. So, I believe ultimately that Enron, is a pretty simple story, in that it just wasn't a well-run business. I mean, there was a lack of business discipline, at the core of the company's problems. And a lot of the more sensational, stories and special purpose entities, the Andy Fast style behaviors, those were really manifestations or symptoms, I think, of a much simpler, much more basic problem.
Discipline that led to, or lack of discipline that led to a liquidity problem, which ultimately led people to behave as they did.
I think that's right. And it could have been a very different story. It had all of the the ingredients of not only a successful business corporation, but a sustainable one in terms of the people. It had an entrepreneurial culture, which is hard to create in a large corporation. It had a lot of the ingredients for success, and for a while was very successful. I think it was very successful in harnessing those strengths. What it didn't do was constrain some of the more aberrant offshoots sometimes of an entrepreneurial culture, and it was that lack of discipline that allowed some of those behaviors, good to a point, but at some point not so good, to sort of run wild. And I think that was ultimately the beginning of the end. And it comes down to leadership. It goes back to sort of Rich Kinder. It didn't have, I think, the best leadership. I mean, leadership matters. I mean, CEOs and COOs, clearly don't do it all. But the tone that they set, the examples that they set make a huge difference. And I think it made a big difference at Enron ultimately, unfortunately.